Hi, welcome to Mr. Otter Studio. Today I'm going to show you 4 different techniques to create snow in your watercolor paintings. I'll be showing you using oil pastels. You could use a crayon for this, gouache, masking fluid, and salt. You can follow along with me, or you can see the effects that these have on the watercolor and then choose the one you like the best for your painting. I'm going to do them all on the same piece of paper so you can see what it looks like. If you want to follow along with me, just grab some masking tape and some watercolor paper. I'm using Mr. Otter Studio's watercolor paper. I highly recommend it. It also comes with 2 brushes, and these are the brushes that I use most of the time. So you can get this on Amazon. It makes a great gift. Grab your paper, and since we're going to be doing 4 techniques, I'm just going to create 4 squares with my tape. I would encourage you to do this along with me. And I like creating these squares just because it makes a nice area for me to experiment in. And then I also like to use this as a reference later on. So just create 4 spaces by creating 2 squares and then just divide it in half, however you would like. Make sure the tape is pressed down, and let's get started. So the first one I'm going to show you is the masking fluid. And the reason I'm going to paint it down first is because you have to let it dry before you paint over it. And I'm just going to make some dots all over my paper, maybe some big, maybe some small. You can kind of flick it on there if you want it to look a little bit more sporadic. Also, I feel like I should probably say that these techniques should also work for stars in the sky. In my tray, I'm going to create a puddle of blue paint and a puddle of purple paint that I'm going to be using over some of these and under some of these. So grab your water and use whatever color you want if you're following along with me. I do want this to be fairly dark so that I can see some of these colors. And if I want this blue to be just a little bit gray and not so bright, which I do, I'm going to add a little bit of orange to it. It just creates a more muted blue. I'm just going to use the bottom of my paper to test it on. Probably want a little bit more color in there. Let's create our next puddle of purple. I'm just using 2 colors because I want to. I find it's a little bit more interesting. The next one I'm going to do is the salt, and that's because this one takes a little bit of time. So I'm going to use just a pinch of salt in this one, but I want to have it ready because if your paint is dry, this technique will not work. And I have these 2 colors. I'm just mixing them and blending them, overlapping them just a little bit, so I don't want to have any lines on there. Grabbing a pinch of salt and just sprinkling it on there. And we'll just let that do its thing while we are waiting. All right, we also need to wash up here so that we can put our snowflakes on top of it. And looking at the salt one, I've realized I need to add way more color because this just isn't as dark as I would like it to be. So I'm going to grab more blue, a little bit more orange, and maybe just add some purple right from my set. So go ahead and paint the top right in or the bottom. It doesn't matter, whatever ones you want to use. All right, let's just let this sit. And while it dries, let's go ahead and do some of the dots for our oil pastel. So grab your oil pastel. You can kind of make it into more of a point. If you want, you can just do that by rubbing it on a piece of paper. I'm going to be throwing away this tape. So I'm just going to create a point by rubbing the side of it on my tape. All right, go ahead and just drop that oil pastel in. And the nice thing with the oil pastel is we don't need to let it dry. So you're just going to paint right over the top of it after you put it down. This creates a really nice resist, I think. So you can see with this one, the effect is taking place immediately, and it's really, really easy to do. If you want to do this technique with younger children, then I definitely would recommend that way of doing it. The salt is starting to make like these really cool snowflake-like patterns already. So we're gonna let these dry, and then I'll come back and I'll show you how to do the gouache technique and the masking fluid. All right, this next technique, we're going to use this top right rectangle, and we are going to be using our gouache. So I'm just going to squeeze some gouache out in my tray for my watercolors. Gouache is thick. I've got to add just a little bit of water to it so I can get it workable. So I'm just using water, I'm using my paintbrush, making sure I can get a nice point. And then you just go ahead and you can paint snow. You also could use gouache and a toothbrush and flick it on there. You can also flick it from your paintbrush, but this paintbrush is not really going to allow me to do that. So I'm just going to start painting it on. You could also use acrylic paint for this. You know, you can make it look more like snowflakes. This would also work for stars. If you were going to do stars, then you would want to do maybe like one that looks like more of an X kind of tilted on its side. If you want it to look illustrative, you can do it so many ways, but a little bit more realistic is if there's some smaller ones and some bigger ones, just showing that some are further away and some are closer. So again, these techniques are just to show you different ways to create snow in your paintings. I love what the salt is doing down here. I think it looks great, but I also really love the oil pastel looks awesome. So what you want to do if you use masking fluid is let it dry, paint over it, let that dry, and then you can carefully rub away the masking fluid. And wherever you masked, it should be the white of the paper. I'm just going to paint from the bottom and go to the top. Why not? Okay, I'm just going to let that dry and kind of do its thing. After your watercolor is completely dry, rub away the rubber cement. After the salt is completely dry, you can remove the salt. Take your tape off, and now you can see those techniques a little bit more clearly. So this top left one, this is where we use the masking fluid. The one below it is where we used the oil pastel. You could also use a crayon. We used a white oil pastel. This one, this top right one, is where we used gouache over the top of our watercolor. Gouache is awesome for using if you need to paint whiskers in or you've missed a highlight in your watercolors. It's great to have as an option. Also for stars in the sky. You could also use acrylic. And then the bottom right is where we use salt. So the reason I love using salt to create the effect of snow is that it really looks like a snowflake to me. Like the patterns that it has and how it kind of spreads out. I think it's probably the most realistic looking. It doesn't get quite as light, at least it didn't for me, but I guess maybe it could if I let it sit there a little bit longer, but I still really love how this technique looks. So choose the one that looks the best to you. There's also many more ways to do this, to create snow in a watercolor painting. These are just the ones that I chose to show you today. In the comment section below, please put the techniques that you've used to create snow in your watercolor paintings. Share your wisdom with us. Thank you so much for joining me on Mr. Otter Studio. I would love to see your work. Post it to Instagram using hashtag Mr. Otter Studio or hashtag Mr. Otter Art Studio, and have a wonderful day.